Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in Game 7 of the 2016 World Chess Championship. First 6 games, we've had quite a bit of draws. 6 draws so far, both sides tied up with 3 points apiece, getting a half point for a draw. Coming into Game 7, we have Karjakin playing the white pieces. He played white in Game 6. Also going to be getting those in Game 7. And then we will alternate. If it does come to a Game 12, Magnus Carlsen will have the white pieces in the last final game. But Karjakin starts out with pawn to d4, so something a little bit different. So that's always good to see. We've seen a lot of the pawn to e4, pawn e5 getting into the Rai Lopez with similar variations all throughout the tournament. So pawn to d4 is a nice change in pace for the tournament. Pawn to d5, pawn to c4, so getting into the queen's gambit line. Pawn to c6, so kind of that Slav defense. Could get into the semi-Slav if he wants to play e6. Could always get his light square bishop out, evolve into the pawn chain. Very common here to f5. And then we see Karjakin play knight to c3, and then knight here to f6. And it's somewhat common to see knight to f3. And then response would be bishop to f5, and then push here with pawn to e6. Once the light square bishop's outside of the pawn chain, then to kind of lock that up. But it changes things after knight to c3. It gets a little tricky with bishop down here to b or f5, because then after the pawn takes, pawn recaptures, queen here to b3, attacking the pawn and this pawn here on b7. And with this knight on c6 attacking, that black is going to go down in material. So Karjakin decides to play a little bit slightly different variation, bringing his knight here to c3, attacking the center, instead of bringing the knight over here to kind of stop that bishop from getting involved too soon to f5. So knight to f6 for Magnus Carlsen, just continuing his development. Pawn to e3, pawn here to a6, and then bishop to d3. And then we see taking on c4. So I don't see a ton of lines for Magnus Carlsen playing the Queen's Gambit accepted line, but he chooses to do that right now. And then bishop takes on c4. You usually don't want to move your minor pieces multiple times, but in this particular case, it makes a lot of sense. You need to go ahead and recapture. Magnus Carlsen's aware of this, and so one of the reasons you decide to go ahead and play that accepted line after your opponent plays bishop here to d3. So after the bishop takes on c4, pawn to e6, and the knight to f3. Carlsen now plays pawn to c5, trying to break up the center of the board, and then castle on the king side. Much prefer castle on the king side than something like pawn to c5, because then you just see the queens come off the board. And then he's either going to have to move his knight back to d1, which he doesn't want to do, or he could capture with his king. Bishop comes down here, c5, pawn to b3, knight c6, and black can even castle. Can get pretty aggressive castle on the queen side if you want to. Doesn't have to worry as much because the queen's off the board. This would just be pretty brutal for white to kind of lose his advantage. Definitely don't want to be seeing this. So we didn't. Instead, we see castle on the king side. Pawn down to b5, forcing the bishop move. Bishop back here to e2. Bishop b7, attacking this knight here on f3. It's part of the reason that the bishop came back here to e2. He wants to make sure his queen's not tied down to any pieces on the board. Pawn to c5. Black could recapture if he wants to with his bishop, but he knows that move is going to be there for a while. First decides to play knight here to c6. He does have the option to bring his queen down here, but it's a little worse than before because queen takes on d1. Okay, well now all of a sudden just Karjakin responds, takes on d1. He's controlling this open file with his rook. That's going to be completely fine for white. So Magnus Carlsen decides not to do that at this point. Instead, knight here to c6, and then knight down here to d2. And knight to d2 is somewhat odd. He has lots of different options here. You know, even if he were to take with queen takes on d8, it's definitely interesting. The rook recaptures, pawn here to a3, bishop takes on c5, pawn up here to b4. It's not too bad. Yes, this rook is controlling the center of the board, but he still has a pretty good position on board right here. But he decides to play something really odd. He gets his knight, which is controlling the center of the board. He brings it over here to d2, which is blocking off his queen and also blocking off his bishop here on c1. Now, his goal is to bring his knight here to e4 and then eventually come to this outpost here on d6. But I think that's pretty optimistic that plan is going to go according to plan. And so we see Magnus Carlsen first take with his bishop here on c5, kind of negating any goodness that you get from a knight here on e4, in my opinion. Now, knight to e4 first, we do see an exchange. Now the knight comes to e4. It's not really doing too much. It's threatening this bishop, but the bishop can just easily come back here to e7, which it does, and then pawn to b3. Another option, but probably not as good now, would be queen up here to d8, and then the rook recapture. I think there's less material on board for white to really dominate or do anything in the center of the board. So now you're just kind of giving your opponent this d file. So don't like that as much. Decides to instead play pawn to b3. Knight down here, a b4, and then bishop to f3. So there was a discovered attack after the knight moves away. The bishop is now attacking this knight on e4. So a few different options as far as how he wants to approach that. He could have even tried something real crazy. I wasn't really expecting it, but he could have tried knight to d2. That would be blocking a lot of his moves, but we've seen some crazy moves from Karjakin, in my opinion. Instead decides to just play the bishop to f3, protecting it, but he is using a lot of the pieces playing defense, not really being proactive, in my opinion. Castle on the king side for Magnus Carlsen, bishop to a3, and he had lots of options here. He could have played bishop to a3, he could have played bishop to b2, could have even tried that knight to d2 as we talked about. That's always an option, but decided to go and play bishop to a3, and then rook over here to c8. And this is interesting for Magnus Carlsen because he also has lots of different options. So when the board's completely wide open, you have tons of material on board. You have lots of different avenues you can go through. Instead of rook to c8, he could have played bishop to d5. Nice little outpost move. And there's a couple options. We could have seen the bishop take here on b4. Bishop takes on b4. Pawn up here to a3, forcing the bishop out. Bishop back to e7. Pawn up here to b4. Rook over here c8, controlling this open file. I think that's going to be completely fine for Magnus Carlsen. If we come back and say, okay, after the bishop to d5, what if knight to f6? Kind of an interesting move. Check, and then what could happen from here? Okay, the bishop takes here on f6. The bishop takes on b4 since the bishop on e7 is no longer protecting that. Then the bishop comes down here, takes on a1. Bishop takes on f8. We see a lot of exchanges on board after the queen recaptures. Queen over here to a1, and all of a sudden, Black has a pretty good position. I don't think he's necessarily going to win. I think it's pretty drawish. Both sides are even in material. He does have a very active queen in the center of the board. I don't think he can capitalize. But all in all, I think these are pretty good for Magnus Carlsen. In the game, he decides to play rook over here to c8, which is met by the knight to f6 check. Now things go a little bit differently now because the bishop is not here on d5, doesn't have protection from the queen, doesn't have protection from this pawn on e6. So now after the bishop takes on f6, we see the bishop take on b7, slightly different. Bishop a1, bishop takes here on b4, so a lot of exchanges. Bishop just comes back here to f6, and then a bishop takes on f8. We see the queen come down here, and then after this take on f8, then bishop takes on a6. So Karjakin is up a pawn in material, so that's good. I think Magnus Carlsen maybe miscalculate a little bit as far as how this end state right here would be. So Karjakin has the advantage, but it is going to be very difficult to really take this and turn it into a win. They have opposite color bishops, which can be very drawish just because you can't really force your opponent to do anything. You can't block off some of the squares because your bishop has no effect on your opponent's bishop because they're on opposite colors. And so you'll see a lot of these very drawish. I think if Magnus Carlsen had the white pieces, he may try for a very, very long game in this position. But Karjakin's going to try to take his slight advantage and turn it into a win, specifically on the queen side since he has two pawns to Magnus Carlsen's one. But pawn here to b4, getting it on the opposite color of the bishop, so the bishop can't attack it. Rook over here, c1, pawn to g6, rook up here to c2. Rook over here, a8, attacking both the bishop and the pawn. Part of the reason why the rook came here to c2 to protect that pawn here on a2. Bishop back here to d3, rook d8, bishop e2. King f8, getting both the kings involved into the board. Rook over here to a8. Bishop c4, centralizing, nice little outpost. Not going to be able to move that at all. King here to e2, king e7, pawn up here, f4. Both sides just pushing material, center of the board. We're now past the 30 move mark. Very important in these tournaments as they can't draw before that spot. King here to f3, rook c7, g4, g5, king to e4, and then rook to c8. So both sides not really trying to break through in this position. They decided to go ahead and draw the game after 33 moves. Now, just a little while ago, I do think if Magnus Carlsen had the white pieces, this game could have gone on for another 5 hours. I don't know that anything would have changed. I think it still would have been a drawn game. I think Magnus Carlsen really likes to play those long games where he knows that he really can't lose the game. If anything, he just puts so much pressure on his opponent that something could happen. They can make a mistake. But I think he even realized in this position that his opponent actually has the advantage. He's not going to be overcoming that advantage and then creating his own. So he said, okay, let's go ahead and draw this, especially he's playing the black pieces. So draw, 7 games in a row draw. Magnus Carlsen will be coming back tomorrow night, or tomorrow. We'll be doing the video tomorrow night with the white pieces, so he'll be looking for the first victory in the tournament. But thanks everyone for watching. We're more than halfway through the tournament, but hopefully you're enjoying the videos, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Thanks again.